I am happy to invite back to the program our good friend, Nathan J. Robinson. Nathan is, of course, the editor and publisher of Current Affairs magazine. He is a columnist for The Guardian, and he is the author of this new book, this poinsettia-colored object, just right for the holiday season and perfect for holiday gift giving, entitled, well, I'll get to the title a little bit more in a minute, but the title is Why You Should Be a Socialist. So, as always, Nathan, welcome back to the program.
Oh, it's so nice to be with you, RJ.
Well, listen, I wanted to start by saying that the title of the book, in my view, is not Why You Should Be a Socialist. The title of the book is Why You Should Be a Socialist.
Yes, they put the U in very big letters.
Well, I noticed that, and I think it's, why you. I picture, those old 1940s, like World War II cartoons where Elmer Fudd or somebody, a giant finger would point at him, and they would say,
Yes.
"Ella, Mr. American, Mr. Ordinary American," and he would say, "Me? That's why you, yes, you should be a socialist."
Pointing a big finger at the reader.
Yes, but an index finger.
But an index finger. No?
Yes. So this book is a delight to read. I'm enjoying it very much. I normally ask authors when they come on the program to explain what the premise of their book is, but I think it's pretty self-evident from the title.
The premise of the book is why you should be a socialist.
Right, and there you have it. But the audience for the book, I would say that in many ways, I am not the audience since I'm, lean socialist anyway.
Right.
Although I think for people who consider themselves socialists or are lean socialists, whatever, it also has value in that it kind of crisply and enjoyably makes the arguments they will have to make at some point. But really,
Yes.
I think, what did you picture, if anything? Who did you picture?
Yeah.
What kind of person when you were writing this?
Right-wing relatives. This is a very good holiday book for right-wing relatives. No, I wanted to write something that was for a non-left audience. The book is not called Why You Are a Socialist Already. It is called Why You Should Be a Socialist. And as you say, it is going to also be for people on the left, because I think there's value in sort of hearing our own arguments articulated as clearly as possible. Writing this book was very useful for me because it was a process of figuring out what I actually believe and how to convey those beliefs. So I think there is value for people on the left, but I kind of wanted to write something that I thought, my working title was Socialism for People Who Are Extremely Skeptical of It. And I wanted something where if you're socialism curious, but you think that young people today don't understand what the word socialism means, or you're wondering what they mean by it, I thought that sort of person who is open-minded but skeptical, I wanted to, at the very least, convince them that people who embrace this label today are pretty serious and thoughtful, and they're not using the term meaninglessly, even though they use it in different ways. And I wanted to try and give a sense of what I think that word means to people.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And if I were to write a companion volume, I guess I might, use Jeff Foxworthy's riff and say, you might be a socialist if ...
Yeah, it's kind of like that.
If you think that water should be clean and pure and available to everyone, you just might be a socialist. If you think that Social Security ought to be available to everybody, Medicare ought to be available to everybody, but you obviously, that might be something I would write from, my contemporaries, as opposed to, but I guess, well, let's start with this. You talk about what the left is so mad about. I think we can agree on that. This show and you and I and our respective audiences have heard that issue belabored. There's plenty to be mad about. Why is socialism and why is it good, including defining the terms socialism, democracy, social democracy. Why is, if you were to summarize this section in a sentence, what would you say?
Oh, the what is socialism section?
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard to summarize in a sentence because, G.D.H. Colin, his 5-volume history of socialist thought, begins by saying, over the course of this 5-volume history of socialist thought, I can't hope to possibly define what socialism means, even though he's got 5 volumes. And one of the reasons is because people who have used that term have always used it differently.
Right.
I mean, But I consider socialism a political tradition, an egalitarian political tradition that begins by being staunchly opposed to class division and the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few, and the absence of the possession of wealth and property in the hands of most people who simply have to sell their labor for a living. Of course, there's more to it, though, than that, because today's socialists are feminists, they're anti-racists. It's more than just an economic philosophy. And that's one of the reasons that contemporary socialism can be slippery and difficult to define, because if the classic definition of socialism was always the abolition of the class system and putting ownership in the hands of workers, today young socialists have many more beliefs than that they put under this label. And there's sort of a broad egalitarianism and opposition to hierarchy. I love Terry Eagleton's definition, which is a socialist is just someone who's been unable to get over their horror at the fact that most people who have ever lived have lived lives of brutal, unremitting, fruitless toil. And I think that really captures where a lot of socialists begin, is looking around them at the world and seeing the fact that the people who work the hardest for the longest hours get the least reward. And that the people who do the least often get the most reward, and kind of a visceral distaste for that mismatch of effort and reward is one of the real core starting points of a socialist philosophy.
You know, that's actually fascinating to me because I always feel that most of us, perhaps of necessity, live our lives tuning out the extent to which the vast human majority, now and throughout history, has in fact, at best, rarely been able to fulfill anything like their full potential creatively, emotionally, spiritually, however you define that, potential for happiness, potential to contribute to society as a whole, that there has been this enormous kind of a stifling of human joy and expansion. And that if you take a moment out of your typical workday to think about it, it's this vast chasm of immiseration or of delimiting of human life. And it is, in fact, appalling. And it seems to me we should each individually and collectively commit ourselves to reducing that misery in any way we can.
Yeah. You know, I'm just reading a fascinating book that I have right here, which is called Socialism by John Stuart Mill. And people often consider John Stuart Mill one of the founders of libertarian philosophy. Right. But this is partially because they've never read the things that he wrote about socialism. And especially later in his life, Mill became very, very sympathetic to socialist schemes and actually defended socialist ideas of the time against their critics. And one of the things that really upset him was the fact that so many people clearly labored all of their lives in conditions of, not necessarily even abject misery, but that people did so much unnecessary work in a time of great prosperity. And he said, and I've just got here, no longer enslaved or made dependent by force of law, the great majority are so by force of poverty. They are still chained to a place, to an occupation, occupation and to conformity with the will of an employer, and debarred by the accident of birth, both from the enjoyments and from the mental and moral advantages which others inherit without exertion and independently of desert. And he says that this is an evil against which mankind has struggled, and that people are not wrong to be appalled by this and to try and imagine ways to eliminate it. And it's funny that that someone who is associated so strongly with the libertarian hands off my my property and my body philosophy, actually, if you go into it, really saw a major issue for freedom in the fact that so many people, bound by the will of their employer and the necessity of working for their daily bread.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point, and it gets me, I'm going to go a little bit out of order in terms of how I wanted to talk about this book. Again, the book is Why You Should Be a Socialist by Nathan J. Robinson, and my guest, Nathan J. Robinson. I'll go a little bit out of order in terms of my own mental outline, because I did want to talk with you about the relationship between socialism and whether you want to call it libertarianism or anarchism or whatever. You address it in the book, and I wanted to bring it up for two reasons. Three, if you count the fact that on those online political preference tests with the four quadrants that really mean very little, I consistently turn up as a left libertarian, which I think for all my online battles with libertarians in columns and so on, I think is a fair description, or, I'm more comfortable with the word anarchism. But the relationship between socialism, which many people, I think, in this country view as a state expansion program, and sometimes it is, and the notion of libertarianism or anarchism or whatever, of self-organizing systems, of people creating autonomous organizations at as decentralized a level as possible. Many people see those as inherently in opposition, but you don't, do you?
Well, I mean, they are in opposition. I mean, I came to my first exposure to socialism was in college. I took a class called Marxism. It was called Red Flags, Black Flags, Marxism versus Anarchism. And it was about the sort of vicious debates that raged from the 19th century onward between Marxists and anarchists over what the meaning of socialism was and what the meaning of freedom was. And but I think the first point to make is that it's very clear that socialism does not just mean, as Rand Paul puts it in his new book, The Case Against Socialism, government control of production, right? That is, and in fact, Rand Paul says, today's young people don't understand socialism because when you poll them, they don't say that socialism means government control of production. Well, I mean, that's kind of funny because the correct conclusion from that is, well, you don't understand clearly what young people mean by socialism because they're not saying the thing that you're assuming that they believe. So economic socialism has always been about kind of worker control or common ownership of a lot more things than are commonly owned. And there's big debate over how many things and what types of things. And there is debate over whether common ownership means state ownership or whether it means things like worker cooperatives. And there's a huge difference between socialists on that. One reason that the state ends up being a major vehicle for greater socialization of the economy is because the state is the one thing that we do all in a democratic society have control of in common. Right? The public library is a state institution, and it's kind of a socialized institution in that we all own and run the public library. The fire department is socialized in that we all pay taxes towards the fire department, and it serves each of us theoretically, it serves each of us equally, right? As opposed to in medicine, that's not socialized, right? It's run, medicine is administered privately by individual entities that are concerned with their own well-being rather than the social well-being. And so it's understandable why people associate socialism with the state, because in order to have a more socialized economy, you might have to have more state institutions. But state institutions are not sufficient to be socialized. And this is important, because one reason that Rand Paul is able to say that the Nazis were socialists and dictators are socialists is because when you define socialism as government control, then any dictator is automatically a socialist, because the more government control there is, as there always is in a dictatorship, the more socialism there is. But that's never been the actual principle that socialists are going for. They're going for the equal participation of all people. And that's why dictatorships aren't socialist, because dictatorships don't have mass participation. They don't have worker or common ownership. They actually mirror the structure of capitalist society, in that there's a small number of people at the top who control the welfare and the fates of all the people at the bottom.
Yeah, so I think that's entirely true. I think there's still this, and by the way, I would parenthetically also say that to the extent that we have public institutions in this country already, which arguably are socialist in nature, I think that's one of the things that people forget, is that that's why you may be a socialist. If you like the library by any reasonable definition I can think of, would be a socialist enterprise, right? Because it's decided upon by common vote of the community. It's publicly funded, and the expense is shared according to need, ability to pay, and it's used according to need. I mean, so I think it passes the test, as do many public institutions in the United States. I would also say, it occurred to me when you were talking about that to a certain extent, in terms of the libertarian axis of this whole question, in a way, many of our public institutions have sorted themselves out rather effectively, because libraries are best administered at the county or community level, which is where they are, I believe, most of the taxation, most of the oversight resides. Social Security and Medicare require, as much scale as possible to be effective. They're managed at the national scale with input from voters nationally. It seems to me there's a certain, it's imperfect, but in some ways a pretty good apportioning of public institutions, arguably socialist institutions, at the minimum possible size necessary to guarantee success.
Yeah, I think that's right. And another important thing is that people associate the state with the most repressive parts of the state, the police and the military. And I think most socialists are anti-militarists, and many of us are anti-prisons. And it's a shame, of course, that government has become associated with repression, because actually the socialist vision for government is a far less coercive. I mean, almost you wouldn't want to give it the same name of the state, because if it doesn't have those features, if it doesn't have the violent and brutal parts of the state, if it is much more like libraries and Social Security, then it becomes much more innocuous. The other thing that I think that I wish Americans would do is to stop buying the propaganda about how government doesn't work. Some government institutions don't work because we don't run them well. I mean, I just rode the Amtrak from DC to New York, and it was horrible. New York subway system is horrible. But of course, as I say, libraries and fire departments and many public parks work great. There are public airports that work great. Not LaGuardia, but Tampa International Airport, where I'm from in Florida, is a county-owned airport that but it's just one of the best airports I've ever been to, and it's a public airport. And Heathrow Airport in London, which is a privatized airport, is awful. And one reason it's awful is because there's no public space, and it's all luxury goods stores, and it's designed to squeeze money out of people. I went to a fantastic public school. There's nothing about the fact that schools are public that causes them to fail, because we have great public schools, and many of the countries that we are always talking about how we're losing ground against, we're losing ground against countries that have great public, state-owned, state-run schools. So it's not the fact of a thing being state-run. It's all about how well you run it and how you fund it.
Yeah, and to me, the short answer to what you just said, when people say to me, we need to privatize that because we can't afford to keep it in the government anymore, my answer is, well, if you really think you can't afford to do it through the government, how do you think you can afford to tack 15% in profit on top of whatever it costs to do in the government, and that's going to somehow work better? The only way that works is if you cut whatever it is that service does by more than 15%. So anyway, I'm going to ask this Nathan J. Robinson of you. It's not directly in the book, but you have written the book, Why You Should Be a Socialist. I've asked it of Richard Wolff and other people, which is, there is the spirit of socialism, the philosophy of socialism, and then there is the political question, the tactical question of when, where, and how to identify oneself as a socialist. I recall having breakfast with some politically active people one day where basically everybody agreed. They agreed with the Democratic Socialist platform. And one of them said, so do we identify ourselves as Democratic Socialists now? Unanimous no's. So there, you have your closet socialists, right?
Yes.
Who are actually aware that of the values and beliefs and philosophy they hold are socialist, or at least somewhat socialist in nature, but they feel tactically they can't admit it. So what do you say to people like that?
Well, my book is a plea to those people to embrace it, right? I used to, it's funny, I used to not use the term. For a long time, probably till I was like 5 years ago, I would use the term anarchist, partially because I liked the effect it had on people. But I came around, and I think Bernie did a great job of bringing me around, in that the Bernie Sanders 2016 campaign, he openly used the label, and I think it's been part of the reason he's successful. It actually allows you to draw a very important distinction between what we are for and kind of left liberalism or progressivism. There are terms that are really easy to water down, like progressive. I mean, Barack Obama calls himself a progressive, Bernie Sanders calls himself a progressive, but they have very different visions of what they want to do. And I like socialist because socialist really does draw a distinction, right? People who use that term, it shows the dividing line, right? Because Elizabeth Warren would say, no, I'm not a socialist at all. And there is a difference captured by who says that word and who doesn't, right? So Warren is asked by Amy Goodman, do you believe billionaires should exist? And she says, well, of course, if you work hard and you make a lot of money and you should have $1 billion. Whereas the people who are socialists think that the existence of billionaires is a kind of feudalism, because it means that you have certain people who have just vastly more social power than other people. And so that word really helps us to understand. I mean, I think we should use the terms that are clarifying and abandon terms that are not clarifying. So, for example, like communist, I don't feel like communist is getting redeemed. I don't feel like that helps anyone to understand a thing. The word socialist, I think it was debatable whether that would be a useful term or we should ditch it. But I think actually that the polling on the word socialist is so kind of, I mean, there are still people who oppose it, but it's so promising that I think now it's actually a fight worth having, because the people who use this term, they do have a set of beliefs and aspirations in common that are coherent. And it's a political tradition that is actually quite clear, even though there are many differences between socialists, even though, like the word democracy, it can be difficult to define at first. I think as a banner, it has got a proud tradition of people rallying under that banner. And I think the people who are rallying under it today have a pretty clear and consistent vision.
Well, I toyed with identifying myself as a gentleman of the left, but I don't know, it didn't catch on.
I like that.
The
I feel it.
obviously, I have this debate with a friend of mine sometimes where he said, "Well, but if you call yourself socialist or leftist, you're not you're distracting people from the fact that many of them already hold the same beliefs," and which does raise a legitimate question, right? I mean, do you like? But you do need, and I agree with you here, you do need something that identifies you as
Yes.
holding these beliefs. And maybe socialist or democratic socialist is going to turn out to be that word. It looks like
Yeah.
it might very well be. Now, of course, there are people who are saying the democratic socialist moment in the United States is over, to the extent that of course, they never said we had one. They just said, now it's over, but they never said we're in it. They just, because you had the Bernie phenomenon and more people, an AOC getting elected and so on, growth of the DSA, but that now the Jeremy Corbyn defeat, for example, tells
Yeah.
us, people don't like that stuff. And no matter how many times I point out to people that polling in the UK shows that Corbyn's platform,
Yeah.
that his ideas, quite socialist actually, were
Yes.
very popular among the people of the UK. I somehow nothing seems to penetrate the hide of that great beast that is now running through punditry,
Yeah.
pundit land, that says, well, Corbyn's defeat has shown that you guys are dreaming. Are we dreaming?
Well, I mean, it's difficult to defend that position considering that in the 2017 election, Corbyn ran on the same platform and increased Labour's vote share by the largest margin since 1945. I mean, it's just plainly irrational because when Labour went up, if Labour under Corbyn increased its vote share and then decreased its vote share, and both of the times they were running on a socialist platform, it's very strange to look at only the decrease and say, well, aha, that proves that socialism isn't viable. I mean, there's a lot going on in the British election. Brexit, of course, the tarring of Corbyn over a period of years as a terrorist sympathizer and anti-Semite. And I think the thing is, I do think there are lessons that the left can learn from Corbyn's defeat, though, which is that I think it is true. I think one thing we can learn is that an economically left platform does not sell itself. Right? Just because you run on things that are popular, you also have to convince people that those things are good. And Labour did a pretty good job in 2017 of doing that and did not manage to do it in 2019. And the difference wasn't a difference in the platform, but we might say that it was a difference between political strategy and, in fact, that perhaps Corbyn was not competent at running that election. And so you have to be competent and you have to organize. And even if you have something that people would like if it were presented to them well, you are facing a really, really determined opposition that is very, very well funded. And unless we work hard, we're not going to succeed just because we have the best policies, and they will crush us. And then when they crush us, they will blame the policies and they will say, aha, this proves that people didn't like your policies, but maybe it actually proves that we were bad at strategy and bad at politics.
Yeah, I mean, I think both sides of the coin you just laid out are true and are lessons for the U.S. I mean, nobody asked me, but I'll throw in my 2 cents too. I'm interviewing you, which is that, yes, I 100% agree that, first of all, that the policies, even when they're popular, don't sell themselves. You have to convince people you're the team that can make them happen. But also, I think the flip side, and you have to do it competently. I think the flip side, the dark side of well, it was all dark, that election, as it turned out, but the inverse of that is also true, which is that they will, as you said, they'll throw everything at you. They will spare no expense. They will break every rule we normally think of in terms of ethics. They will lie about you. They will smear you. The coverage in the mainstream media will be shockingly slanted if you come out with a genuinely socialist or progressive or left program, that you can expect all hell to break loose, and if you're not prepared for it, you will lose. And then, as you say, of course, they'll blame the policies. So, all right. Before we close, I also want to ask you what else is. Well, first of all, what didn't we cover about this book? Why you should be a socialist? What else would you like to say that perhaps I forgot to ask?
Well, it's it's crammed with ideas and content. So how could we possibly get through? People need to pick it up, and they'll see that I have. One thing that I'm really proud of with the book is the appendix, where I recommend all kinds of left media for people, because I think I don't just want to present my ideas, but I want to introduce them to this very vibrant new left media ecosystem that we have these days. And in fact, the Zero Hour gets a plug as one of the institutions that people should listen to and support, and I hope they do. So I wanted to introduce people to all these wonderful new left writers and podcasters and YouTubers who are super smart and worth following.
And lastly, before I let you go, is there anything else happening on the media and the political landscape today, book aside, or including the book, as we record this on December 18th? Anything in particular catch your eye? I saw you wrote a piece on.
Yeah. Well, I just wrote I have an article in The Guardian today about impeachment and why impeachment feels so anticlimactic and unsatisfying. You and I had a conversation about this last night where we pointed out that even though, obviously Donald Trump is, meets the definition of unfit for office, there is something that is profoundly, I don't know, it doesn't feel quite the righteous victory that it ought to. And partially that's because Trump isn't being charged for his most serious actual crimes, the things that have the worst consequences for humanity. And so it doesn't allow us to feel as if we're really bringing. I compare it to Al Capone being caught on tax evasion charges rather than all the murder.
Well, it's actually a little bit worse than that, in my view, because I think I always look for the dark cloud inside the silver light, which is inside the darker cloud or whatever, which is because I think it is, and we talked about this a little last night too, but I think it is the one area of impeachable action that, in pursuing it, reinforces, first of all, the national security status quo, which I'm adamantly opposed to, and kind of elevated some of the actors in that to what I consider to be an undeserved resistance hero status, which I've been writing about for years. It just drives me crazy that someone like John Brennan or James Clapper can be considered a hero. So I think it reinforces all that, which deeply disturbs me. And I think politically it will also be a meh, when it comes to 2020, because it keeps Hunter Biden in the news, which is bad. It begins to read like elites defending one of their own, rather than a blow for the people against an oligarch, which is how it should, the narrative that should be, I think, coming out of this. And they stepped on their own impeachment for whatever reason by signing on to the trade bill at the same time. So it's all led to a phenomenon I've come to think of as impeachment ennui. Peggy Lee, is that all there is? And hardcore Democrats that I know are excited about it, but I don't think the overall public is either learning from it or being motivated by it. So that to me is a little bit disturbing. But maybe you and I are the exceptions. I don't know.
Yeah.
So with that, I guess I have nothing else to ask you, good sir. I mean, we could, as usual, we could talk forever.
People should buy.
Yeah, there we go. Stereo view for those of you watching. Why You Should Be a Socialist by Nathan J. Robinson. You have, among other things, props on the back from Noam Chomsky. So that's pretty good too. So I encourage people to check the book out, as well as Current Affairs and Nathan J. Robinson, as always. Yes, sir. You have something
likewise, I encourage people to financially support the Zero Hour, one of my absolute favorite left-wing media institutions, and I hope that people will also go to patreon.com/the0hour and support you as well as buying my book.
Oh, thank you so much. And with that, you have certainly guaranteed another invitation onto this program, I'll tell you that. So Nathan J. Robinson, it's always a pleasure talking to you, and talk to you soon.
Thanks, RJ.